We don't have a free market, don't kid yourself.
The free market isn't really free.
Grace Blakeley.
Grace Blakeley, the author and self-proclaimed Moe Marxist, Grace Blakeley.
Companies are avoiding tax, or the tax system isn't working properly.
It's immoral, it's irrational, it makes absolutely no sense. Where is all this money going?
So the only way to shift that is to states will allow corporations sometimes to get away with murder. It is only possible to resist what's going on if people work together and organise.
We are going to unite and level up.
You were lied to, I'm afraid. You were lied to.
Never, ever in my lifetime have I seen what is patently a corrupt government like this one.
Fraud has never ever worked. Eventually, things go south. When the hell did we forget all that?
Hey, how are you?
Hi, good, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, really good, really good. So, the crux of this conversation came around from your amazing book, Vulture Capitalism, that I read through on the weekend, and man, I was blown away. But before we dive into that, let's start with a little brief introduction into who you are, what you do, and why.
So I'm Grace Blakeley. I am an author, most recently of the book Vulture Capitalism. I've also written a couple of other books, Stolen: How to Save the World from Financialization and The Corona Crash. And yeah, I am a writer, I am an economic and political commentator, I appear quite a lot in the media, and a socialist activist.
The book itself is entitled Vulture Capitalism, Corporate Crimes, Backdoor, Bailouts, and the Death of Freedom. Why is it that we're not free? And why do we live in a society where only some can be free?
Yeah, so that is one of the main arguments of the book, really. And it goes back to these points that were made by kind of neoliberal thinkers in the early part of the 20th century. And their whole argument was that social democratic systems were creating unfree societies. So thinkers like Hayek argued that the increasing role of the state in lots of different areas of social and political life, from the provision of public services through to more public investment, nationalization, that was leading people down the road, what he called the road to serfdom. And the idea was that the state would come to overtake many different areas of social life. And neoliberal economists and thinkers put forward this set of proposals that in order to promote human freedom and protect people from the overbearing power of the state, there would need to be measures that were put in place to promote free markets, as they described them. These ideas were championed by politicians like Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, who came to power and privatized lots of state industries, cut spending on public services, and generally put forward this idea that they were seeking to shrink the size of the state. And my argument starts by really taking this apart and saying that the arguments made by the neoliberals didn't really match up to what happened when neoliberal politicians came to power. And that was always the intention, that the idea behind neoliberalism wasn't actually about shrinking the state. It wasn't about making the state less powerful. It was about changing who state power operated for. So in the post-war period, when you had social democratic systems, workers and unions were much more involved in decision-making processes and had a much greater role in all areas of public policy. And this was really the thing that the neoliberals wanted to attack. It was the role of workers and unions in the operation of state power. So they really pushed this narrative that shrinking the state would promote freedom, basically. And they had this quite narrow definition of freedom as kind of economic freedom or consumer freedom or just freedom to compete within markets. Now, there are lots of problems with that definition of freedom. Obviously, if you don't have the resources to compete in those competitive markets, then that's not going to create a fair society. But the bigger problem is that even on their own definitions of freedom, the kinds of free markets that the neoliberals constructed were never actually free. And this is because, for lots of reasons that I outline in my book, but firstly, they're dominated by massive monopolistic corporations. So even this kind of very limited idea of consumer choice that the neoliberals put forward isn't guaranteed in this system. If you look on the shelves and it's products all from the same kind of 5 companies, even though they're differentiated by brand, they're all owned by 1 or 2 massive corporations. And those corporations have a huge amount of influence over our government. They have a lot of power to shape the conditions of our society, over climate breakdown, over employment, all these different sorts of things. And the neoliberal state is not actually a smaller state. state. It does quite a lot of stuff very proactively. Thatcher came to power and immediately declared war on the miners and unleashed the power of the finance sector, which meant the government ended up giving huge amounts of support to the finance sector. The state became very strong for some people and weak for other interests. And so the argument is really this neoliberal shift. It was never about freedom. It was about promoting the interests of those at the top, promoting the power of capitalists within the state and within other social institutions. And in doing so, what we've seen is this concentration of power at the top of society. So a small number of large corporations, financial institutions have gained much more market power. And they've also been able to organize within the state to get their own way, basically. And that has led to the erosion of our democracy, because there's so little real democratic accountability. The example I use in the book is Greensill, which is this finance company that hired David Cameron, the former prime minister, to basically be a lobbyist for them. And when they were going under during the pandemic, Cameron was firing off text messages to all these different people within the state saying, Greensill needs a loan. Can you make sure that they're able to get one from the bailout funds that were available at the time? And eventually it did. It got a big loan from the British Business Bank that all ended up basically going to waste because the firm eventually collapsed. So this kind of indicates this issue, which is that the powerful have lots of tools to be able to influence what happens within the state, whereas the average person doesn't.
And we see it in the water industry as well at the moment. I think that, was it 76 billion in dividends that they've taken out in the last however many years? And now if you look at things like Thames Water, they're being asked to invest 500 million and they're refusing to do so. The likelihood is that that'll end up coming back into nationalisation, but at what cost? If you look at capitalist models traditionally, successful ones should succeed, ones that shouldn't should fail. But often, as you've said in your book, Greensill being one, there's a number of others in there that we'll likely go on to discuss. The interlinkages between corporations and also government is actually is benefiting a small minority of people to the detriment of others. And there's a topic that you talk about with respect to planning. I'll probably butcher the quote, but I think you said something about the question we should ask ourselves is not whether planning is possible in a capitalist society. Instead, we should ask, where is the planning taking place? How has it been executed? And whose interest is it serving? It's the key question.
Yeah, totally. So the argument takes apart this idea that I think a lot of people have, which is this distinction between centrally planned socialist societies where the state basically does everything, and free market capitalist societies where everything is determined by the kind of chaotic forces of the market. And yeah, in the book, I show that the free market isn't really free, that actually markets are dominated by a number of large and very powerful entities that are able to shape what goes on within those markets. And that even when they do perhaps get into trouble, then the state is always there to bail out companies that have close enough relationships to it. So the example I use at the moment is Boeing. And Boeing's been through the succession of crises dating all the way back to the 7 MAX disasters, when nearly 300 people were killed in 2 separate plane crashes, and can be traced back to this culture of like cost cutting and corner cutting within the firm. And it turns out that the CEO, senior executives knew about the problems and didn't do anything about it. And there were whistleblowers within Boeing saying someone's going to have to die before anyone actually deals with these issues. So Boeing had all these problems, tried to cover them up, and it was being supported by the American state the entire time because it's this deep part of the kind of US military industrial complex. So it has lots of government contracts, and it was the biggest recipient of corporate welfare in the years of the crashes. It got massive bailouts during COVID. And this was after the disasters had happened and after a lot of the issues had come to light. It still got loads of funding from the US state during the pandemic, and is just generally a really big and important player within the US defense industry. And so it can rely on the fact that it will be bailed out, like the banks could rely on the fact that they would be bailed out. But if you're a small business or a consumer being threatened to be kicked out of your house, you don't get that same advantage.
And you go on to give loads of examples like Fordlandia, where you drill into Ford, the US paycheck protection programs, Amazon. I don't want to spoil it because I encourage everybody to go out and buy the book and take a read because it's absolutely amazing. But I guess one of the central premises that drew me in as well was that of disaster capitalism. So we all know people like Naomi Klein's shock doctrine. But the bit that really stood out to me was when you mentioned in the book that after the savings and loans crisis in the US, thousands of bankers were convicted of fraud and other charges. But after things like the financial crash, only one banker was sent to prison. Why do you think that is?
There's a book I reference quite a lot in the book by Greg Barrack, and it's basically about the state routinization of crime is what he calls it. And his idea is that we live in society societies where the crimes of corporations are basically facilitated and allowed to happen, whereas property crimes or crimes that are committed by individuals, generally lower social classes, are ruthlessly policed. So he has this idea of the state routinization of crime, which means that in certain areas of society, states will literally allow corporations sometimes to get away with murder. He points out that there's no such thing as corporate manslaughter in US law. So corporations often can literally get away with murder. And there are few, if any, mechanisms to prosecute corporations that have committed kind of grave wrongdoings, whether that's to do with the environment, to do with tax, to do with the way that they treat their workers. And that, yeah, this is not an accident or the result of a law that isn't being sufficiently put into place. It is really the result of the existence of particular structures and institutions that exist to make sure that big corporations can get away with doing whatever they want. And the financial crisis, there in the book, I look at how a lot of the mechanisms that had existed to prosecute executives in positions of power in the finance sector when crises like this happened had been undermined. The idea was that there wasn't any need for this regulation because the market would sort it out. And of course, that idea only works when the market actually functions as it's supposed to. Whereas we live in a world where the market does not function as a market, it is captured by vested interests.
Yeah, it's crazy. Like just today, for example, if you do that comparison between like white collar crime and also society as a whole, like one of the things that really made me feel a bit sick, to be honest, when I read the article was the government in the UK are looking to criminalise homelessness. And it, to me, it's so skewed in respect to there's 6 trillion of wealth hidden in tax havens. We listen to people that govern our country talking about growth. And to me, like one of the easy areas is to address the wealth inequality. It seems to me very much like a reverse Robin Hood, where the financial crash and COVID has pushed power and wealth upwards rather than alleviate some of society's most pressing problems.
Yeah, totally. This whole thing about criminalising homelessness is just absolutely horrendous. And it really does bring to the fore this idea that state power is really used in favour of the class interests of this idea that neoliberalism gave us a small state that just does less and intervenes less in people's lives. It's just very powerful. It's very interventionist. The issue is it just uses its power to harass and criminalise and undermine those workers, basically. And you see this with all the anti-protest laws, with anti-union legislation, all that sort of stuff. And also to support the interests of those at the top, big subsidies and bailouts to large corporations that need it.
Yeah, definitely. There was a stat in your book that stood out as well. It was by the end of 2021, 1.1% of the world's population was held by nearly 46% of the world's wealth. And at the same time, I think it was the Roundtree Foundation released a report in the UK, I think it was last week, where they talked about 3.6 million children in absolute poverty. In the US, that's 11.5% of their population in national poverty line. Like the parallels just, dumbfounding, to be honest.
Yeah, inequality has become a massive issue, and it's obviously been exacerbated and worsened by the last kind of several Conservative governments' policies, particularly austerity. Austerity's led to a breakdown in the functioning of our public services, which are most relied upon by those on lower incomes. It sucked demand out of the economy. It's really the big floor in incomes at the lower end of the income spectrum, care workers, people working in health, education, etc., as well as making life more expensive for most people. We've got these massive issues of basically broken public services and a Conservative Party that is failing really to do anything about it because they've all been taken in by this austerity ideology, which can also be traced back to this neoliberal thing of we need a small state. And it's just bollocks, isn't it? Because the state is very happy to spend tons and tons of money supporting the interests of the rich, just isn't happy to spend money supporting the interests of working people. And my argument in the book is happened because there is this big imbalance of power in society. And basically what the state does, what all social institutions do, reflects this imbalance of power. So if you want things to change, you have to organise from the ground up and demand that things are different.
In respect to power perspective, why is power so concentrated in respect to the so-called road to selfdom? It just seems a little bit like a double truth to being told one thing, but the realities are totally the opposite. When you look at taxation, I mentioned about the 7.6 trillion in offshore wealth asset managers. they oversee 22 trillion of worth of assets and hold a fifth of all shares in S&P 500. I was listening to Rachel Reeves, for example, talking about the UK's desire for growth, and the funds are there, the money is there. It's an argument and understanding about taxation and a redistribution of wealth.
Yeah, it is partly about that. But again, the issue is it's not just about taxation and it's not just about redistributive policies, because again, you can't expect anything to change for as long as the same people have control over the kind of reins of power, basically. So the argument in the book is basically that it's a Marxist argument. So it's like looking at the balance of power between the people who own the things that we need to produce everything and everyone else who has to sell their labor power for a living. And when you look at the power of capital within the state, it's massive. And it's partly because of the concentrations that we have seen emerge in the economy. And that has to do with loads of different things. But generally speaking, the Marxist analysis again is that capitalism becomes more centralized over time. So a smaller number of larger firms come to dominate their industries. And when you get a firm that is able to outcompete its rivals, it's then able to use its profits to buy up its rivals, as we see in tech and finance and other sectors. It's also able to develop very close links with banks and financial institutions, which allow them to get access to cash to expand even more. And they're able to develop really close links with government to influence the way that government works. The issue isn't just that companies are avoiding tax or that the tax system isn't working properly, because there's a reason that companies are able to avoid tax and that the tax system doesn't work properly, which is that they have massive influence over what happens within the state and influence over what politicians think and say. So the only way to shift that is to build up a counterpower capable of resisting corporate power. And that's historically come from workers, organized workers within the labor movement, but also social movements and people organizing on the streets.
Yeah, I think also in respect to the power that they've been able to utilize, a lot of it comes down to lobbying. We see it in the UK. We saw it without naming names. Everybody looked to the news recently and look about the NHS and look about where they opted to say that they were going to invest money during the budget at a time that loads of doctors and nurses, of which we all clapped for on our doorstep not too many moons ago, striking and asking for a more balanced and suitable pay because due to in line with inflation. The ability for large donors and corporations to lobby, that's detrimental to everything, because if you can circumnavigate the entire rules of the system and have a seat at the table, then yeah, it slows down progressive change. We're seeing it within the transition to green and the slowing down of that evolution that we need to see within society today.
Yeah, I use the example in the book of ExxonMobil, which knew about climate breakdown all the way back in the 70s because it had a scientific department working on this idea of the greenhouse effect, and it found unequivocal evidence that what is happening now is going to happen. And instead of spreading the word about that, they cut the funding for their climate research team and placed that money into funding climate denialism and supporting shadow groups that spread misinformation about climate breakdown. And also in lobbying, there was massive lobbying budgets for all the big fossil fuel companies and personal donations to particular senators that have a lot of power, like Joe Manchin, for example, who's a Democratic senator that has vetoed a lot of progressive climate legislation because he literally takes money from climate lobbyists. A Greenpeace reporter went undercover to talk to one of those lobbyists for ExxonMobil a while ago, and he was basically saying that they'd delivered all these massive wins on behalf of the fossil fuel industry by lobbying senators and Congress people, and that they'd actually lobbied for the introduction of a carbon tax because they knew that was never going to happen. So it was a kind of cynical move to undermine any attempt to really develop good climate policy. So yeah, this lobbying power is obviously massive in the States. As I mentioned with Greensill, there's loads of other examples in the book. It's a really significant factor here too.
One of the other things as well, back to planning, is the topic of nudging. So nudging over the edge, because you mentioned that like neoliberal governments seek to plan with, and one of the examples of this is things like Windrush or the Rwanda nonsense that we see within the UK at the moment. Can you elaborate a little bit more about nudging over the edge?
Yeah, so this is the idea that state power isn't just about direct government spending. It's about the ways that governments push us to behave in certain ways. And an example of this is the nudge unit. So this was a unit set up by David Cameron to use the insights from behavioral economics to try and basically change people's behavior. And initially it was fairly benign. The idea was that you change the way that forms work so that people have to opt out of becoming an organ donor rather than opting in, and it will increase take up. So they did that, and it did increase take up of organ donation, which was obviously a big positive thing. But it's leapt into lots of other areas of policy, and eventually there was this unit that was dedicated to trying to nudge people out of the country. So basically make life for immigrants so difficult that they eventually just decided to leave. And this was all to do with the Windrush scandal. So it was things like cutting access to benefits, making it harder for people to work. And there are some examples in the book of people who've been basically shoved out of the country by these measures, or just because they been unable to work. They'd been left on the street, basically begging after being pushed out of their jobs. And yeah, this was an example of where the violent power of the state meets the bureaucratic power of the state, and how this is so consistently wielded against working people. And obviously, the whole idea behind migration policy, or the importance of migration policy in a capitalist society, is that it's really important for companies to have access to lots of migrant workers. But it's also really important that those workers feel really insecure, so that they don't organize or resist or try and agitate for higher wages or better conditions. And so migration policy is really central to that.
And the knock-on effects of that is, I'm saying this from living up in Newcastle, and I've worked all over the world, and then I've lived in multiple different locations, and never have I felt the palpable feeling of powerlessness up here as to anywhere else. To me, it felt like it started during Brexit, when people had an opportunity to voice their discontentment with the current system, but then beyond that, it's just continued to perpetuate. Like, the North-South divide has never felt so divided, and people aren't in a good place up here, and it's sad because we're surrounded by exceptional talents, but again, in the concentration of wealth and also the concentration of opportunities, it's leading to a poverty of opportunity for people in a society. It should be about giving people the opportunity to dream more, do more, and believe that they can achieve more. And yeah, at the moment, it seems very much a resurgence of power for the few versus the powerless of the many. And that to me is really detrimental for where we are heading as a country.
Yeah, I write a lot in the book about this issue of like powerlessness, and how like the concentrated power that exists at the top of our society among like big corporations, financial institutions, and within the state is really meant to make ordinary people feel like they can't resist and they can't fight back. And part of this is to do with individualism. So Thatcher said there's no such thing as society. And her whole idea was really to make ordinary people feel like they couldn't participate in collective institutions or community organizations, because all of these institutions were really at the vanguard of the resistance to Thatcherism. They were resisting the closure of the mines, they were resisting closure of community spaces, privatization, etc. And it's really been the decimation of our social fabric and our foundations of community life and of collective organizing that has facilitated this shift towards this free market system, and that has allowed power to remain so concentrated in the hands of those at the very top of society. Basically, because it is only possible to resist what's going on if people work together and organize. So I use the example in the book of the Lucas Plan, which is where workers came together in Lucas Aerospace, and they put together this plan which basically showed how they could take over the company within which they were working and have it be democratically run and worker owned. And it was an amazing plan that everyone was really excited about at the time. And emergence of Thatcherism and the war on the labour movement just meant it never happened. And Thatcher ended up shutting down the GLC as well, which is where a lot of people who were involved in that plan ended up going. So the whole idea of this shift was really to make us feel less powerful so that we didn't try and fight back and do things differently.
Yeah, like I've heard you talk about collective consciousness versus toxic individualism. And yeah, there seem to have done some kind of indirect and in certain elements direct effect upon people's mindsets, that this perceived hustle culture that we see today, whereby it's our fault if we aren't succeeding within society, whereby there's no opportunities there. Like, I've spent a lot of times in the games industry, and if you look at that industry as a whole at the moment, they are laying off people left and center as they then consolidate and look towards mergers and acquisitions. And it's the same playbook. And it's really frustrating watching on that people are blaming themselves when the crux of the issue often lies in the basic needs of people in societies aren't being met. Yet the blame has consistently been shifted towards individuals rather than the opportunity that we have, which is about collective action and change.
Yeah, so I talk about this quite a lot. It's 60, 70 years ago, if you had a problem with your wage, you would have gone into work and talked to your other co-workers, and you would have gotten together and said, we're not getting paid enough, we can't put food on the table, so let's organise and demand that our boss pays us more, basically. And that was how so many things were won. The 5-day working week, labour rights, increased wages, all of these things won by workers organising and making demands as groups. Whereas today, if you can't afford to put food on the table, then you just blame yourself. You think, oh, I'm a loser, I've done something wrong, I can't compete in this system. that has been designed to make sure that I fail. And you might go out and take out a high interest payday loan, or just all of these mechanisms that we use to deal with our own kind of disenfranchisement and people's exploitation. They just come back to like individualistic ways of responding rather than organizing together in groups to try and fight back.
And it's that we really need at the moment. We need more people to have a voice and come together to push for more progressive policies for change, because at the moment it's a similar story that what we've seen since Thatcher, really. When you look at the push for capital control, we saw Thatcher in the 80s push for privatization. We went to the miners' strikes, etc. We then followed that route all the way to the financial crash, which was driven through a issue to do with housing and investments. And again, this isn't the people who owns the houses' fault. It's actually the people that are making those random bets upon the industry, which again, like there was no accountability there. We bailed everybody out, and we went, because of that, into an age and era of austerity whereby people naturally feel like they've been left behind. We live in the UK where I think we've got the highest tax rate that we've ever had, and people are being taxed through the teeth and charged through the teeth for what? No services at all. And again, when you look at things like the pandemic, one of the most striking things, I think it was Gary Stevenson that talked about this on something I was watching the other day, but he talked about the deficit since the beginning of COVID is 800 billion, which equates to £16,000 per person in the UK. So on that, where's the money gone? And because at the moment, all we're doing is paying and we're getting nothing in return. And it's led to huge wealth inequality. But ultimately, for me, it's the poverty of opportunity. It's taking opportunities away from good people and good businesses and good opportunities to innovate and inspire others. And it's a system that's designed to make sure people fail, and it's wrong.
Yeah, totally. Austerity has been a really, really good example of that. It was a failing that was caused by these massive financial institutions that were taking egregious risks without really imagining that they would ever have to bear the consequences of those risks, because they knew that the state would always be there to bail them out if anything went wrong. And instead, it was working people who've been made to suffer. Austerity's led to just unimaginable harm that has been caused throughout our society. So people have died, yes, from not getting access to benefits, or because they've been stuck on an NHS waiting list, or because they're in a social care system that is completely and utterly defunct and often owned by private equity houses that have zero interest in providing real patient care. But it's also really torn apart the social fabric of our society and has created just like kind of desolation in a lot of places where there's been no investment, there's been very little support, no investment in public services, and huge amounts of poverty that just aren't being addressed at the right stage. And this is particularly bad for people who have combined severe physical and mental health issues. Like, a lot of people are just being failed by the system, and so they're ending up homeless or like in prison, or putting pressure on other parts of our public services because their issues haven't been treated at the right stage. And this is a particular problem for people who have complex overlapping needs that aren't being met by our public services systems. So people who are children who grow up in institutional care, our children's social services are completely broken. Like, children are constantly being failed that are put in the care of the state. And then they're much more likely to end up homeless on the streets, like generally experiencing problems throughout their lives. And they just slip through the nets of all of these systems that are defunded and partly privatized. And then we're told like there's no money to deal with any of these problems. It's because the problems have been allowed to fester for such a long time that they've become much more severe precisely because of austerity. And now we have these massive problems, and governments just refuse to look at the long-term implications of failing to invest for such a long period of time.
And now we're landed within a cost of living crisis. There's issues around poverty and the evident issues around water, etc. The question that I look at amidst these waves, is it not simply just a result of planning?
Yeah, so there's this problem of accountability, which is that those at the top know that they're able to get away with almost anything, and they're not really going to be held accountable for their actions. And I think this is a real issue, and it's something that has been exacerbated by the bailout culture that we have, particularly in certain areas of the state, where the answer is always, we're seeing it with Thames Water at the moment, bail out the shareholders and bail out the people at the top, rather than actually allowing them to pay for the consequences of their own actions and supporting people who have been harmed by that. It's always massive bailouts for those at the top and then hardship for everyone else. And there's always an excuse for that, which is, oh, if we let it go under or if we don't save those at the top, then it will have worse implications for everyone else. But that's only because the decision has been made not to provide support for everyone else throughout the economy.
I guess like the worst part of it comes down to things like capital strike and capital flight. I think you gave an example like Zambia, where you talked about the issues in respect to their support, and also when the money went in, there was always that threat of a capital strike and capital flights.
Yeah, the example of Zambia is really horrifying. It's where the title for the book came from, because Zambia was targeted by this Vulture fund, which basically knew that the government of Zambia was going to be unable to repay its debts, and so bought up the bonds of the Zambian government, planning on suing the government when it was unable to pay its debts. And this is what happened in the wake of the financial crisis. Copper revenues went through the floor, and there was this balance of payments crisis, so the Zambian government couldn't afford to pay. These investors sued the government in these international courts and ultimately took money out of the Zambian healthcare system, meant that the health minister was saying, because of this, there's money that isn't available for healthcare for kids who are dying, basically. And yeah, that just shows how deeply unfair the structure of the world economy is, and how it is really biased in favor of those at the very top.
Your book seems to be separated, when I was reading it, into two parts. One about the realities that we face today, but then ultimately there was a positive side of it at the back end in respect to collective action and change. You talk about the architects and the bees, and I'd love to close out with some examples that you are seeing throughout society, both now and also in the past, that have actually started grassroots movements for change that have led to some positive impacts. And it's how ultimately these collective points of action are going to drive the change that we really need to see in society today.
Yeah, totally. So I end the book, as you say, with all of these examples of democratic planning that are happening now. So these are like examples of people who are organizing in their local communities to build different models of democratic economic planning. So there's like the participatory budget, and use that to increase spending on like public services and education. There's the example of a little village in North Wales called Blaenau Ffestiniog that started up a load of community enterprises, and then got all those community enterprises together under one roof, and they all figured out that they could support each other and support the community as well. So they developed a community energy company that provided support for people who are struggling through the cost of living crisis. There's the Preston model also in the UK, where the council has been working on what's called the community wealth building agenda, using the power of rooted businesses to create jobs locally, to boost public services, and to build up this alternative model to the failed outsourcing model. And then there's loads of examples of union organizing and workers coming together to take on employers and demand a seat at the table.
I could talk to you all day, but just to close out with one final question, it's more so about key thoughts and takeaways that you'd like to leave with our audience.
Don't reduce politics to voting, because politics is so much more than voting. It's something we do every day. So join a union if you can. Maybe see what community organising is going on in your local area. Join a renters union or a tenants union. Maybe get involved in the environmental movement, whatever. All of these things are politics, and they give you a sense of the power of collective action and how we can work together to shift the way our society works.
Thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been great chatting to you.